So where were we before we were so rudely interrupted having this video split into two parts? Oh yeah, I remember. So let's just skip it back a few seconds and carry on. Okay, so that's just a basic simplified look at the structure of the ZFS file system. So this structure is something we need to keep in the back of our mind when we're planning how to set up our TrueNAS VM. So TrueNAS really needs direct access to the disks. We need to keep the layers as few as possible between the TrueNAS VM's disk and the bare metal server behind it. So the best way to attach the disks to the TrueNAS VM is by passing through a disk controller to it. So this can be either a PCIe HBA card or even one of the built-in SATA controllers on the motherboard. Whatever the case, this will give TrueNAS direct access to our disks just as it would be if it was a bare metal machine. So this is definitely the best and preferred way to set up a virtualized TrueNAS. So you might be wondering, if you didn't have actually a disk controller which you could pass through, could you just pass through some individual disks to the TrueNAS server that way? Well, yes, I guess you could, but there's one thing you're going to have to look at if you want to try that. When you create a VDisk on a VM, whether it's a pass-through block device like this you can see here, or just a regular VDisk, by default, in order to try and improve performance, a VDisk has a write cache. Data being written to the RAM first and then later flushed through down to the disk. So this additional layer would need to be disabled by disabling the write cache and setting it to cache equals none, and by doing this it will give TrueNAS more direct access to the particular disk. Now I'm sure some of you out there are wondering, can we just set up a TrueNAS VM using just regular old VDisks? I can almost hear from here the FreeNAS community shouting, no! And they'd be right, it's no good for keeping production data on, but if you want to just try out TrueNAS and see what it's like, then it's fine for just testing purposes. So really, if you want to use TrueNAS properly and use it in production, then you're going to want to pass through a disk controller and use it that way. Now let me show you what hardware I'm using on my TrueNAS VM. So recently on my Unraid server, I upgraded some of the disks to larger sizes, from 8TB drives to a mixture of 16s and 12s. So that left me with 4 spare Toshiba 8TB drives. So I had the drives, but I had nowhere to put them. My case was full. So I needed an external enclosure for 4 drives. And the enclosure had to have a mini SAS port. Now it was really hard to find something suitable, but finally on Amazon I found this Highpoint Rockstore 4-bay storage tower. And on the back, yep, it had mini SAS. Awesome. So as soon as it arrived, I chucked the hard drives into it and patiently waited for the HBA card I'd ordered, which luckily arrived the very next day. And the card that I bought was an LSI 9212 4i4e, and I got this from a great eBay store called the Unraid Server. Now many people in the FreeNAS and the Unraid communities buy from this store because he sells genuine cards that are firmware and BIOS flash so that they're in IT mode. Now what I really liked about this card is the fact that it has a mini SAS output for an external enclosure, but also 4 internal SATA ports as well. So I needed to be able to connect the card to the enclosure. So I needed to buy a mini SAS 8088 to 8088 cable. I chose a long 2-meter cable because I wanted to put the enclosure quite away from the main server. So everything I bought for this project, there's going to be links in the description of the video if you want to check them out. Okay, so that's the hardware covered, so now let's move on and look at the software and how to set up the VM. Okay, so here we are across on my main server. This is my main array here, 72 terabytes, 2 cache drives, and down at the bottom here there's an unassigned disk that I use for various things here. But these drives here, this SSD, and these 4 8TB drives, this is what's connected to the HBA card. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go across to Tools, System Devices. If I scroll down here, you can see there's the card with all of the disks attached. So I want to isolate this from Unraid by binding it to the VirtIO or stubbing it. I'm going to tick this here. Now select Bind to VirtIO at boot, and obviously for that to take effect, the server needs to be rebooted. Okay, so with the server rebooted, we can't see any of those disks now the controller's been stubbed. That's perfect. So let's go across to the VMs tab, scroll down to the bottom and add a VM. As TrueNAS is based off FreeBSD, I'm going to choose the FreeBSD template here. Now obviously I'm assuming you've already downloaded TrueNAS, then after which you've copied it and then placed it into your ISO share so we can use it with the VM. Okay, good. Okay, so before we start, I'm sure there was something important I had to tell you. Hang on.
Library computer, data TrueNAS being received.
Oh yeah, I remember now. Obviously when we're running TrueNAS we want to have very fast network speed, so we want to use a VirtIO network adapter. Now, there's a problem. There's been this bug since 2019 where the VirtIO drivers fail to load when we're using a VM with the Q35 chipset. So, that means we're going to have to choose i440FX. Then if our BIOS is OVMF and we try and do this, then loading the install media at one point will just freeze. So what we could do is just load everything with the BIOS set to CBIOS and the machine type as i440FX and everything will be fine. But I want to have my VM running as OVMF. Not that it really makes a lot of difference. So because I want it as OVMF, I'm going to start the install with the BIOS as OVMF and a machine type as Q35. So now this way it won't load the VirtIO drivers, but I can get the install done and then come back later and change it. So that's what I'm going to do. Okay, so starting at the top of the template, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change the icon here to this nice TrueNAS icon here. Now if you don't have custom icons, just download and run my container, the custom VN icons one here, and it will install them all for you. So obviously I'm going to change the name here. Now this template will be deleted later. It's just to set up TrueNAS for now. So the only thing here you need to really make sure is just the name of this template is what you want to eventually call the VM. So I don't really need to bother how many cores I'm going to use or how much RAM here. I just need to make sure that it's Q35 and OVMF. Now I'm going to choose the install ISO. And now for primary VDISK location, this location is where we're going to install TrueNAS 2. Now I know earlier I said we shouldn't really use VDisks, but this VDisk isn't going to be used for storing data, it's just for the OS, and when TrueNAS boots up, just like Unraid, it's all stored in the RAM. And for primary VDisk size, I'm going to choose 20 gigs. Now like I said earlier, due to the bug with the Q35 chipset and VirtIO, I'm going to change the VDisk bus to SATA. Okay, so I'm going to scroll down to the bottom of the template now. And here's my stubbed disk controller here, so I'm going to select that for pass-through and click on to create. Okay, so now the TrueNAS install media is started up. So here we just need to choose one and then have OK highlighted and hit enter. Now this is where we're choosing where to actually install the operating system to. These here are the 5 disks that are attached to my disk controller, and this one at the top is the virtual disk. So choose that disk by pressing the spacebar and again hit enter. Okay, so it's warning it's going to erase the disk that we just selected. That's fine. Now here we need to choose a root password. So choose one and pop it in. Then press tab and enter. As this VM is OVMF, I need to choose boot via UEFI. Okay, so now the installation is complete. So let's hit enter. We want to reboot and not shut down. So we need to hit 3 and then OK. Then the VM will reboot and it will do its final part of the installation, which will generate a 2048-bit long save prime. This will take quite a long time, but it's only done the once. And anyway, I'm going to speed this part right up. Okay, so the numbers generated, so the boot up process will now continue. Okay, so now because of the bug with the VirtIO drivers, we don't have a network interface. So what we're going to do now is just type 11 and shut the system down. Okay, so now I want to go back to this template here and click edit. The only thing I want to know is the location of the VDisk we just installed the OS onto. So I'm going to copy that to the clipboard. Now if you notice the location is in the domain share under the name of the VM. With that done, let's go back to the VMs tab. So now I'm going to delete this VM. When you remove the VM, be sure to choose remove VM and not remove VM and disk, because we still need that VDisk. So now let's scroll down to the bottom and add a new VM. Again, FreeBSD template. Now we need to name it the same as we did before and change the icon again. So now we want to choose the amount of cores to use with the VM. I'm going to choose 2 cores and 4 threads. And for RAM, you may have heard that you're meant to allocate 1 GB of RAM for each terabyte of storage you're going to have in TrueNAS. Well, I don't think that's necessarily true. You can allocate less. But if you've got plenty of RAM in your server, and I've got 128 gigs in this server, then if you've got enough, allocate 1 gig per terabyte of storage. Now, I know you guys are going to say, hey, with the ZFS, don't you have to have ECC RAM? Well, you don't actually have to. That's a bit of a myth. You don't believe me? Well, how about if you hear it from Matt Aarons? To paraphrase what he said, is there's nothing special about ZFS compared to any other file system that makes you need to have ECC RAM. He basically says that ECC RAM is good for any file system, and if you really love your data, then it's best to use it. So if you've already got ECC RAM in your Unraid server, great. And if you haven't, well, just don't worry about it. Okay, so moving on. So now let's change the machine type here from Q35 to i440FX. And scrolling down, we don't need the install media anymore. And for the primary VDisk, if you name the VM the same as it was before, then you'll find this filled in for you, as it can see the VDisk there from the previous time. If you can't see it, then you can actually paste in the location which you copied from the template earlier, or just double check that the name is actually exactly the same name as you'd named the VM before. Now we can leave the VDisk bus as VirtIO now, because we're using i440FX, and scrolling down, I'm going to change the network model from VirtIO Net to VirtIO. I find for me I get a little bit better performance out of VirtIO as opposed to VirtIO Net. Okay, and so lastly, obviously I have to add in my disk controller again. And with that done, I'm going to scroll down, I'm going to leave Start VM after creation checked, and then click on to create. And then the TrueNAS VM will start booting up, but this time with i440FX chipset, which will allow the VirtIO drivers to load during boot. Okay, great, so this time we can see an IP address, and for me it's 10.10.20.155. So we need to open up a browser and pop in that address, and that will bring us through to the TrueNAS web login. And our username here is root, and the password what we chose earlier. Okay, so here we are on the TrueNAS dashboard. So the first thing I'm going to do on the left here is I'm going to go to System and then General, and here you can select your language and time zone, and you can change the date and time format if you like. I'm going to change mine like this, and once you've made the changes that you want, then click on to save. And so now let's go back to our dashboard. Now, I don't really like the name TrueNAS. I wish they hadn't changed it. And really, what's this logo like? It's not cool. So, we can change it. Let's go to the little cog here, go to Preferences, and as well as changing the actual theme, we can change the name and put the old logo back. Yay! Oh, that's better. We've got the cool old shark back again. Well, okay, I guess we better do some serious settings now. Let's go across and set up a static IP address so the web GUI's IP is always the same. So go across to network here, then interfaces, and here's my network adapter here. So I'm going to go across to the right and click here, then click the edit button. So here I'm going to put in the IP address that I want for my FreeNAS server, and now I'm going to uncheck DHCP here, and I'm going to click on to apply. So the good thing about the network settings in TrueNAS is you're able to test them first to see if they work, and then if they don't, it just reverts back to how it was previously. So let's do that and click on to test changes. So once we've done this, the GUI on this IP address won't be responsive, so we need to pop in the new one that we've changed it to and log in. So as I can log into the GUI, I know everything's fine, so I can click on Save Changes to make this permanent. Right, so now we've got a static IP address. Let's set up some storage. So on the left here, click onto Storage and go to Pools, and you can see there are no pools here. So I'm going to click on to Add and create new pool, and now we can see all the disks I've got in the system. Now you can either choose the disks you want yourself or click Suggest Layout. I want to use these 4 8TB disks for this pool. Now it's suggesting that I use RAID Z2, which means 2 of these drives can fail and I don't lose any data, but I only get 14.5 gigs of space. For what I want, RAID Z is going to be fine. That's just like the old-fashioned RAID 5. I've got redundancy where I can lose 1 disk. Now we need to give the pool a name. I'm going to call mine the Matrix. Now you do have the option to encrypt the pool if you want to. I'm not going to bother here. So now I'm just going to click on to create, and TrueNAS will prepare and format those drives. Right, so all of those drives now are formatted in that pool and the pool's ready to use. Okay, so just off camera I added 3 SSDs to the server. So I'm going to set up another pool now. Obviously I'm going to click on to Add, again create new pool, and this pool I'm going to name it Neo and click Suggest Layout. Okay, I'm not sure why it's only suggesting I use one of these SSDs. So now I'm going to manually put the other 2 in, and I'm going to use RAID Z again for 1 disk of redundancy and a total of 1.8 usable terabytes. Okay, so I'm going to click on to Create, Confirm and Create Pool. And so now I've got 2 pools here, one of 20 terabytes and the other 1.7. One with regular spinning Rust and the other with SSDs. Okay, so with the pools added, I'm now going to create a user. So if we go onto accounts here, now first let's have a look at groups. You can see there are none here. And if we go onto users, we've got one user, which is the root user. But what we need to do is add a new user, so we need to click onto add. And here put in our name and the username we want for the account. If you want, you can put in an email address, then just pop in the password and confirm it again below. Everything else we can leave here as default. If you're using Windows 8 or newer, you can tick this box here, Microsoft account, and click on to submit. Okay, so this username's been created, and every time a user is created, it also creates a group for it. So now if we look on groups, we'll see that the space group's been created as well. Okay, so now let's go back to our storage and back to pools. And now on our pools, we can create a data set. So if we choose a pool and click on the three dots, and then click add data set, and we can just give this a name. And I'm going to call this dataset users. I'm going to leave everything as default and click on to submit. Okay, so we can see we've got one dataset here. So now I'm going to create another dataset off this main one here, which I'll use for my user. So I'm going to click on add dataset. And this one's name is going to be called Space Invader. And again, just as before, I'm going to leave everything as default. Okay, so now if we click on this arrow thing here, we can see under the users dataset, we've now got Space Invader. So now again, let's click on the three dots here and choose edit permissions. And we can see at the moment the owner is root and the group is wheel. Now we want to change the owner to be that of the username we set up earlier. And also for the group to the group of the same name. Okay, so we can see that the owner here is root and the group here is wheel. We need to change this to the username we just created and to its corresponding group. Now we need to tick this box here, apply user and apply group. And the access mode we can leave as it is, giving full read, write and execute to the user, and also both read and execute to the group and to other users. So with that done, we need to click on to save. And now we need to go to sharing here, then Windows shares, and click onto the add button. Now we need to browse through to the pool and then the data set which we want to share. So I'm going to choose this one here, Space Invader. Everything here I'm going to leave as default and click submit. And it's going to ask if I want to configure ACL. So I'm going to click on to configure now. And we get the option here to use a preset ACL, which I'm going to do. On the drop down here, we can have an open, restricted or home. I'm going to choose for this share restricted and click continue, which basically allows the owner and the group to access this share. So with that done, I'm going to scroll down and click save. And now the share should be available. Okay, so now let's connect to this share from a PC. I'm going to use a Windows VM that's running on the same server as this TrueNAS VM is running on. And if I go to Network, TrueNAS, now it's going to ask me to enter the credentials. So the username I made up was space, and pop in the password. And I'm going to check remember my credentials. Okay, so we can see the share there now. And there we are inside the share. I've got a Windows 10 ISO here, which is roughly 6 gigs in size. So let's copy that across into the ZFS share. So copying the ISO from the VDisk of the VM across onto the ZFS array is pretty swift with good speeds, and everything seems to be working fine. So let's come out of Windows now and go back to TrueNAS. Okay, so now let's look how we can connect a dataset onto the Unraid server and add it as a remote NFS share. Now we could add a remote SMB share, but the great thing about an NFS share is it actually allows us to run a VDisk over the share. We can't do that with SMB. So let's go back to TrueNAS, and here in my matrix pool here, I'm going to add a dataset. And I'm going to call this VMs, and click submit. And again, under this main dataset, I'm going to create some sub datasets. One called Windows 10, one called Mac OS, and finally another one called Pop OS. Okay, so if we click on this arrow here, we can see the datasets that are here. Now the reason I've created individual datasets underneath this main dataset is because later on I might want to use snapshots. And so with snapshots I can actually roll back the VDisks that will be placed in here. But in order to do that I have to have a different dataset for each snapshot. But what I'm going to do to the server is to share out the VM's dataset, which will then have access to all the sub datasets in there. So let's go across to services here and enable the NFS service. Okay, so now we want to go to sharing here and go to Unix shares here and click on to add. And now we need to browse through to the pool and then to the dataset. Like I said, I'm going to add this one here at the top and I'm going to check all directories and I'm going to click on advanced options here. Now here where it says map root user, I'm going to click on the drop down arrow here and this time I'm going to choose root, and under map group I'm going to choose no group. Okay, so what we can do here is we can authorize various networks to be able to connect to this share or even individual IP addresses. Well, I'm going to only allow my Unraid server to connect to here. So I just need to put in its IP address, which is 10.10.20.199, and then click on to submit. Okay, so that's all set up now. And let's go back across to the Unraid server and click add remote share and choose the Linux icon here and next. Now let's click search for servers. This IP here is my TrueNAS server. So let's click next and now let's load shares, and there's the share we just created. So let's select that and click done. Okay, great, so it says success. Now let's try and mount it, and there's the share mounted. So if we click onto it here we should be able to see inside, and here we can see Mac OS, Pop OS and Windows 10. So let's just check we can write into one of these directories. Let's just take Pop OS for instance. I'm going to copy the location here, open a terminal window and just type CD and then that location. So now I'm inside that folder. Let's try and make a directory. So I'll make one called test. Okay, and there we are, it's created fine. So refresh the page. There's that directory we've just created. And just to show you the difference between folders and datasets, if I go back to TrueNAS now and go to storage and then pools, when I go to the VMs dataset here and Pop OS, there's no actual subfolders that are shown because a dataset is slightly different to what a folder is. Okay, so that's just a basic overview of a couple of things we can do with FreeNAS. If I get a lot of interest from this video, then I'll go into far more detail about how to use FreeNAS and things we can do with it. But for now, that's pretty much going to bring us to the end of the video. Now, one nice thing about this FreeNAS VM for me is because I've got my external disk case, I've put a smart plug on that. So if I shut down the TrueNAS VM, I can then turn the disks off to save power. And I've actually got this all automated. I recently bought a Stream Deck and I've been playing with that for the last few days and it's really awesome. From the Stream Deck I can press a button to start up the TrueNAS and to shut it down, and it will also start up and shut down the actual disk enclosure by the press of a button. Basically the Stream Deck SSHs into the server and runs a script which when it turns on the TrueNAS, it first turns on the smart plug, waits for about 10 seconds and then starts up the VM, and to turn it off basically the other way around. I might make a video about how to integrate a Stream Deck with Unraid to better start up VMs, containers and that kind of thing, if that's something people might be interested in. Anyway guys, the video is very long, so it's time to wrap up now and it's time for me to go. But if you like the video then please hit the like button and please share the video with anyone who you think might be interested in watching. So if you haven't already subscribed to the channel then please subscribe, hit the notification bell so you can see new videos as soon as they're uploaded. Now I just want to give a really big thank you to all of my patrons and supporters out there. Guys, thank you so much for all of your support. It's you guys that really make these videos possible and I really appreciate it. Anyway guys, it's time for me to go now, but whatever you're up to for the rest of the day, I hope it's good and I'll catch you in the next video.